All right, hi everyone. Prep time is over. Just a quick check with Orcom. Okay, yes, so we're good to start. All right, before we go into the full formal introduction, can I just quickly check? Opening government, are you guys here? Opening government.
Oh, hello, sorry, here.
Yeah, you're here, cool. Opening opposition, are you guys here?
We're here.
Yep.
Okay, closing government.
Yep, we're here.
Closing opposition.
Yes, I.
Okay, cool. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the open finals of Korea pre-WUDC 2021. The motion for this finals reads, this House believes that the theory of communism is immoral. Before going on with the debate, I firstly want to congratulate all teams for making it to this finals. In opening government, we have Ateneo OV. In opening opposition, we have PDP 1. In closing government, we have Oxford 1. And in closing opposition, we have Edinburgh A. Next, a quick introduction of the judges for this finals. My name is Amira. I will be your chair. Judging with me are Brent, Claudia, Lovro, and Noluthandu. Before proceeding any further, can I get a quick check of teams and if they would like to express any preferred pronoun? As for the judges, I think there is a high preference that all debaters refer to the panel as a whole in a gender neutral language. So can we please start with opening government if you'd like to express any preferred pronoun?
Hello. So hi, my name's Julia. I'm the first speaker of OG, and my gender pronoun would be she or they. Thanks so much.
Hello, my name's Ignacio. Second speaker, he or they, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening opposition.
Amna speaking first, she, her.
Jane speaking second, speaker position, please.
Closing government.
Hi, I'm Sharon speaking first, she, her, please.
Okay.
And Aniket speaking second, to your late, please.
All right, closing opposition.
Kara speaking first, she, her, please.
Jason speaking second, no preference, cheers.
All right, thank you. Lastly, just some housekeeping stuff. Firstly, I will be keeping my camera on because I feel like it's a little bit weird when people debate and as a debater, you're speaking into the void of black boxes. So I think it's highly preferable if judges can also keep their cameras off if it doesn't interfere with your internet connection. I also highly encourage that all debaters do the same, but especially so if you are the one speaking in that moment. Secondly is that Claudia has kindly volunteered to keep time, but I also do highly encourage debaters to keep time themselves. Lastly, before you start your speech, please do indicate how you would like POIs to be offered to you, whether via the chat or verbally, or even just like putting up a sign saying POI. All right, if everybody is good to go, I now invite the Prime Minister. Here.
Hello. Hi, could you hear me? Just checking if I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay. POI is in the chat also. Okay, ready. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What does a theory of communism look like? First, it is the belief that private property is immoral and we should abolish it. It is belief also that we should give all the money to the state and the state should redistribute it to anyone. The second is the transition from capitalist to a communist economy requires a vanguard party that controls the redistribution. We think that's immoral too. But lastly, there is a call for people like the proletariat to rise up against the bourgeois. We think on opening government, we firmly believe that all of these are immoral. And this is not a particular debate about particular instances where it has failed or succeeded in the past. It is about the theory and the assessment of that theory being immoral. What are these standards of immorality? There are two things. First, the things that are most immoral are those that take away human agency. That is the reason why we think sexual assault is immoral, slavery is immoral, and violence is immoral, because it takes away your capacity to live and to make free choices. The second is when you deprive these individuals of basic needs. That is why we consider theft immoral and corruption immoral as well. Let's go to the first argument, given that we've already established those things. First argument is, the theory of communism, in the three respects I explained earlier, are all immoral. Let's go to the first one. Why is massive redistribution and everyone being equal is immoral? First, because it reinforces state-enforced slavery and takes away your agency. Part of the most important freedoms that people have is their capacity to work, what they can do with their work, and what they can produce. This is an essential freedom because most of your working day, actually the vast majority of your life, is spent working. So for a state to dictate what your resources should be, what should be taken away from you, what jobs you could take on, and what you can produce, and severely limiting all of those things, is basically taking half or like 3/4 of your life. And we think this is extremely harmful because you're taking away that human agency first and foremost. That's the first reason. The second reason as to why this is immoral is because you're using the body of that human person to produce labor without the equivalent compensation that you should be giving them. Whatever work you do, you'll be given the same amount of resources. Same amount of resources, same amount of compensation under any communist society. You are then instrumentalizing these people. The same thing we did with African Americans before, where we exploited their labor, but we only gave them the bare minimum resources, which is also equal. Opposition might say it's good because you're giving them basic necessities, right? Through redistribution or whatever. But just because you give them the bare minimum does not justify you exploiting them and giving them just the same equal amount without necessarily being able to compensate for more, like more effort, gives you more monetary gain, for example, in the same way that we have in a capitalist society now. So given this, let's weigh this up then. Why is agency the most important thing as opposed to the material necessities that may coming from opposition that can be provided by the state? It is because what a good life is subjective for every individual. It means that your agency to choose what a good life is for you is the most important thing as opposed to whatever material necessity you could have to sustain your life. Let's go to the second reason that I explained earlier. The theory calls for a need for a transition from capitalist to communist society. Why is that immoral? The reason is because you need a vanguard party that will lead the planned economy, that will lead the transition. This vanguard party is likely to be a very small group of people who are likely to be abusive because they have their own self-interests to forward. Humans are inherently flawed. At some point, they will make mistakes. But even if they're benevolent, the theory itself, which is a few people who will dictate what the society would do, not in a representative democracy, again, we're talking about a communist state, could do is actually immoral because of two things. First, it is unclear why these people have greater legitimacy over everyone, especially if it is not a democratic state. Why are their rights and power more important than everyone else? But secondly, putting the lives of some few people can potentially make mistakes, even if they're benevolent, is actually very, very problematic. The point at which we have to rely the state for towards these just few people, right? Let's go to the last reason then. The theory calls for a rising up against the bourgeois. Why is this immoral? We think any call for violence or rising up is immoral. The reason is the violence would inherently have to target innocent individuals, people who are part of the privileged class of the bourgeois, even if it is not their fault because they were privileged, again, birth lottery, all those things, you will have to target them, make it have some form of violence targeted towards them. But this also harms the poor because through casualties, you make them rise up, risk their lives, and join the fight, even if there are a lot of risks involved in being able to be part of that big revolution. Let's have the weighing. We think it's not clear as to whether you'll succeed of overthrowing capitalism. I think that's a huge goal. It's very, very difficult to do, but the harms are guaranteed. So again, the goal is speculative. Whatever benefit you'll get is speculative, but all these harms of targeting innocent individuals, of targeting the poor, of making them risk their lives is guaranteed. Before I proceed to the next argument, closing opposition.
Even if we believe that these are all intrinsic qualities of communism, which I think that you have just asserted, you have not engaged with what the comparative is. Why are people going to be less exploited in an other type of system?
Yeah, okay, so let's deal with this on the second argument. I think it clashes directly. Why won't it lead to the comparative of things, for example, like the provision of basic services and the best case of opposition? First is because it relies on a centrally planned government. The problem is, after a certain phase, it becomes unmanageable. It becomes too difficult, right? Everyone has different varying interests, needs, and demands that you have to reconcile as that communist state, and the trade-offs will have to be done. Versus on our side, where we think that having an economic free market, where you let anyone fight for their own interests, their free choices as like in accordance with their human agency, to have free reign, which actually has natural checks and balances, like regulations, competition, etc. The impact is it leads to miscalculation of how much the state will produce, which leads to things like hunger, for example, insufficient basic needs. But lastly, we think private property is needed for innovation. We're talking about life-saving R&D, for example, that can only happen if you have the incentive to create this kind of R&D. You need to create an incentive for people to use their brilliance. If communism doesn't provide them with this incentive, because you're just giving them the same monetary pay, the same resources, regardless of how much work you put into like whatever thing you're investing in, we don't get this kind of innovation, which leads to foreseeable outcomes of not having enough medicine for our ever-growing number of diseases, not having enough technological solutions like climate change, not having enough resources for the kinds of like hunger and famine and poverty that exists at present right now. This is important because our problems evolve as over time, and it continues to grow bigger and bigger, but our capacity to be able to help or to be able to like override that time lag, right, is actually something that is less, or it's not that big. So given this, you are leaving out a vast majority of people, the people who are most vulnerable, and we think that a communist state, the theory of communism, is therefore immoral. For all those reasons and more, I'm very, very proud to open this debate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome Leader of Opposition. Here.
Just as a note, I'll take POIs in the chat, but if it's at the 5:30 mark, I would strongly prefer that people just speak out loud at that point to make sure I get to a POI. Sometimes I'm on another screen and don't see the chat as fully. Panel, without a theory of communism, the poor will continue to grow and suffer without a means of escape. The rich will be trapped under the assumption that material wealth means that they are better, while they actually remain corrupted in spirit and in their morality. I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, it's important to clarify in the debate what the theory of communism actually is, because I think the OG is mistaken in a lot of ways. First, I think the theory demands that people get their basic needs provided despite whatever effort they're able to put into, i.e. if you are disabled, for instance, or are not able to work as much, you still get your basic needs provided to you. Second, I think communism often emphasizes the labor theory of value, which means that the value of goods and material things in society are dependent on the labor of the person who puts into it, i.e. that the people who make the goods are the ones who put the value into it, not the people who just like sell them or like control the means of production. I think thirdly, it rejects the idea that one person should own the means of production, because that means they get an unequal amount of bargaining power in society and get to control the lives of other people to too great a degree. And I think lastly, a huge theory within communism is this idea that history ultimately leads to communism, i.e., unlike a lot of other theories, it does not explicitly endorse violence. In fact, it just says that the tides will inevitably turn because the society and the way that we are working the world simply cannot continue to operate in a way that makes the poor suffer. It's notable to say that in the Communist Manifesto, it never actually explicitly says how we're going to see the tides turn, like these tides change, etc. This means you don't get this like extreme violence that we hear from OG, or like this vanguard party is like the thing that needs to usher in this change. I think they're probably just referring to Leninism. That's an entirely different debate. Maybe they feel like they'd be more likely to win it, but just not what we're debating today. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about what we think actually determines morality, because I feel like that has been severely undercovered. Now, under any definition, communism and the theory that it presents ought to be defined as moral. First, I think we often think that things that are premised on the idea of fairness are what is moral. I think we often define fairness as things that A, make it so that you're only rewarded and punished for things that are explicitly within your control, and that you're not punished in a way or rewarded in a way that has significant damages on your ability to have good future outcomes, i.e. that we probably think it's unfair to punish someone and that completely prevents them from ever being rehabilitated or bettering themselves or trying to do good in the future. Secondly, I think oftentimes when we're talking about a theory, we ought to talk about the theory itself and not how that theory could be implemented, considering that oftentimes like any theory can be manipulated and then implemented in bad ways when people have bad intentions. So for instance, like religion is often manipulated in ways to get people to do bad actions, even though like the premises of religion itself are not that bad. We therefore think that we should only be talking about the theory, not just like how it has been implemented in the past, how it will be implemented in the future, and how it's like impossible to be implemented in any way. I think it's also like we do have examples of how it has been implemented in good ways. Like a lot of smaller communities often do things based on communist principles, i.e. things like sharing goods, etc. We think like smaller states are totally capable of making it such you have central planning without corruption, etc. We also think there are two major theories of morality. The first is the idea of utilitarianism, which we think ultimately communism is able to achieve, i.e. that they're able to get the best outcomes for the most amount of people. We think this is particularly true when you think about principles regarding diminishing marginal returns, i.e. that when everyone is put at more of an equal level playing field, rather than like some people getting extreme goods, you actually get better results in terms of not engaging with diminishing marginal returns, because like a rich person gaining a lot more doesn't really mean much because they already have a lot, whereas like making it so that like the poor and everyone is on the same equal playing field probably does mean that people's utility is impacted to a greater degree. And I think even if you use like deontological principles on equality, that you're probably again like better able to achieve morality under this principle of communism, because like communism basically is the like best political theory for equality, considering that people are now able to live with similar amounts of goods. Going into the specifics of why we think each aspect of communist theory is specifically moral. First, I think the idea that you get what you need and you're provided with the basic goods, no matter what effort you're able to put in society, is just overall a good thing. I think the natural lottery, i.e. the idea that the things that are skills that you have in society or your placement in society are things that are out of your control, means that most things are out of your control, and therefore fairness ought to determine that you're still provided with basic goods. I think this is especially true in the idea that essentially like we live in a deterministic universe. I think this also rebuts the claim that we get from OG that nobody will ever be incentivized to do things like innovate or get like doctors to like make medicines, etc. I think that people often get satisfaction and will continue to better themselves despite the ability to gain things like material goods. That is to say, like we were all debating despite the fact that there's not like a huge material good that we're getting at the end of this round. Like we're probably all still want to get the one. I think doctors want to save lives and will probably look into ways to research medicine, even if they don't get like extreme amounts of material goods from these things. I therefore think you're still likely to get things like innovation just because people want to better themselves as a whole. But before I go on, I'll take a POI from CG.
Yeah, so something like John Rawls suggests everyone should have a baseline, but then also that there's allowed to be inequality within that. That's not communism. That's something that we can still have on our side.
I think the problem with these theories is that first, oftentimes the inequalities that you're still presenting are often determined by things outside of people's control, i.e. like, I don't necessarily control my natural innate born ability to be intelligent. Therefore, I think it's unfair that I get better things in society just because I have that inherent inequality. I think communism still allows people to be unequal in this sense, i.e. that like you can still be smarter, like develop medicines, etc. You're just not given more material goods as a result of things that are outside of your control. I think that's principally a good thing. I also think it's just generally bad to want human beings to suffer as a result of things that are outside of their control. Like I think this idea of punishment is really damaging to society, prevents people from advancing in the long term. It also has trickle-down effects on their family, i.e. things like if you are punished or not able to gain material wealth because of your own inequalities, it also prevents like your future generations from being able to like gain wealth because we have a lot of like generational wealth inequality. I secondly think things like the labor theory of value are just good because the alternative to the labor theory of value is things like speculation, i.e. that people just get like the value or are determined to like provide value just on their ability to speculate, which is literally totally out of their control. I think putting things under the value of people who actually contribute to it and put in the most strenuous work is the least elitist thing to do and also the most moral things to do. I also just lastly think that controlling the means of production, i.e. that giving it to everyone, is the most moral thing to do. I think this matters because with giving the means of production to just one person, it often lets them control other parts of society like the government. And I think it also makes them have all the bargaining power in society, which literally makes every other human being in the world treated like a worker and an animal. I think it's wrong for OG to say that our entire lives are made up of our work. I think human beings are capable of much more than that. We should allow them to self-actualize and have bargaining power within their own lives.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, yes. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. So at the end of this first exchange, we now have 3 standards to judge this debate on. The first is the concept of fairness that LO provided, and secondly is the concept of agency and the concept of the provision of basic needs, which we provided, which I will assess right now. But before that, I just want to take down the implied POI coming from closing opposition. So they said, are the alternatives better? Note the burden of this motion specifically. It is not to say that communism is worse than any other political outcome, or political system. It's just to say that communism is immoral. It is possible that multiple systems are immoral. It's possible even if one system is less bad than another system, that both of them are equally immoral. In the same way, you can have 2 very bad boyfriends, even if one potential boyfriend might be marginally better than the other. That's important because no matter what closing opposition says about why maybe capitalism might be immoral or any other form of current systems are immoral, doesn't disprove the claim that this particular system is immoral, and therefore we still take the debate, assuming they try to prove that under their side of the house. So firstly, on the issue of fairness, is what they try to bring up. So they say the problem right now is that people are born with a birth lottery of different needs and different resources, and therefore a purely meritocratic system, which only allocates based on how much you contribute to society, is unfair. I might probably agree with this, but that's not what communism necessarily asks for. Notably, any reasonably moral individual will still believe that some degree of agency should be a prerequisite or determination of your material condition. For example, if a person, even in a communist society, does a crime, if a person does a crime, even if you believe a communist framework, presumably you'll still deprive them of the rights to property, you'll put them in jail, you'll deprive them of the rights to liberty, which recognizes that it's absurd to just think that there's no moral agency of any particular individual, and your choices or your actions are somewhat a determinant of the material conditions that you provide. Importantly also, coming from leader of opposition, they conceded that their side will also have some degree of inequality with respect to the intelligence people have, etc., with no real moral distinction about why material inequality is different from the inequality you get from your intelligence, your looks, or whatever other facet within society, which implies that it is perfectly fair for you to give some wealth to people based on the amount of contribution and effort they have. It does not mean it's the only metric, but it should be a balance of your current needs, but also the amount of conditions that you have under their side. The question now is, does communism account for that? We would suggest it does not. Because while communism recognizes a problem, which is full meritocracy is a problem, it overcorrects for it and therefore becomes equally unfair. Because even if you contribute to society, given if you're a struggling poor individual who comes from a poor background and you work your way all the way to the top, you will still have the same compensation as a person who's incredibly lazy and given all the potential circumstances or all the potential privileges in life. That means that you're still equally unfair, or even more unfair, because you're inherently taking away any potential choice of agency, and therefore you're allocating only on the basis of an arbitrary equality, which we would suggest is problematic. But secondly, we would suggest that to a degree to believe that meritocracy is unfair because it only cares about agency, to a degree to believe that communism only cares about the current humanity that you are in right now, and there's no ability for you to differentiate yourself with any other individual, means that you're far more likely that that's inherently an unfair system already. The next thing we have to talk about is agency. Noticeably, they barely responded to this case. They just said that the vanguard party system and that the violence is not an inherent part of communism. Even if you believe that, it does not take away the central planning argument, which is to say, the very fact that people can determine what people should work on, how much they should produce, and what are the outcomes of a particular society in any communist society, because that's inherently how the community works. The entire society determines what your job is and what private property is inherently immoral because it takes away your agency as a human being to determine your work. We explained to you why this principle is important, because even if some people are poorer under their side of the house, that's less important because it's unclear why material conditions are the most important facet of your life, which we've told you, and it allows people to have the subjective decision to make that. But secondly, it's untrue that violence and the vanguard party are not part of the communist ideology. It's important for you to have even an answer to how you transition from capitalism. That's why the vanguard party is an essential feature of that. If not, the communist ideology will be not actionable. But secondly, the point about violence is it's talked about by Marx, right? The fact that he wants the bourgeoisie to rise up and lose their chains, etc. So you can't just claim and assert that it's not inherently part. It is inherently part, and you have to engage with that on the rest of the house. Before I move on, let's take closing opposition.
Yeah, so even if you are correct and morality does not exist in a vacuum, the problem is your case is contingent on the practical effects of this theory, meaning that you need to engage in comparative analysis with what the alternatives would be in order to prove that your harms are illegitimate.
No, it's actually not contingent on the practical effects. If the theory dictates that you should take away the ability for people to choose what they produce, and the state should determine that, regardless of how that's applied in practice, that's already immoral already, right? Regardless of what is efficiently produced, the fact that you take away people's ability to choose what they work, which is half their lives, so you're basically subjecting half their lives to slavery, that's the immoral outcome that we're trying to fight for in today's debate, regardless of how it is practically applied. That means even if you provide them with all their basic needs and services, which you gave you the parallel example of like slaves in America, for example, where they were given their basic needs in some instances, we would consider that still immoral because the provision of basic needs is not sufficient to reparate the taking away of agency, which is the supreme good relative to any other utilitarian benefit, which requires you to will it to be valuable in the very first place. Then let's talk about the provision of goods and services. So they claim that redistribution works and it's a good thing because we're able to provide basic needs to everyone. I want to point out that even if there's a burden to prove a counter model, theories like socialism, theories like the welfare state already sufficiently account for the basic needs of a lot of people. It's unclear why you have to go beyond that socialist standard or why you have to go beyond the welfare state standard under their side of the house. But secondly, note that the entire principle of redistribution for it to work assumes a benevolent group of individuals and assumes, for example, that these people are competent enough to potentially account for the different needs and interests of different people. Noticeably, any person who reasonably assumes that is probably naive and negligent with the very fact that you're giving a lot of power to a very small number of people who don't really know what they're doing or you're not certain whether or not they're doing good. So even if it sometimes can be properly applied, the fact that on balance it's likely not to be the case means that the theory is problematic to a degree that's applied under their side. But secondly, they say, well, there will still be incentives for innovation regardless. That is our point. You need a consolidation of wealth to act on that incentive to innovate, right? You need about a lot of money to invest in a particular industry you want on our side. But secondly, the incentive at best is retroactive because people will have to face problems. That's why they feel desire to deal with them, but not proactive, which capitalism or any private property, conception of private property provides because you want to make more money and therefore you have an active search for potential problems in the future. That's why to a degree you're able to believe that they're able to provide in the short run. In the long run, it's unclear how they continuously provide the basic needs and services of these individuals. At the end of this debate, on these three grounds, we take it, and that's we're very proud to win. Thank you.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Okay, awesome. Can everyone hear me? I will take POIs in the chat, but if I get to 5:30 and I haven't taken one, feel free to interrupt. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I don't think OG sufficiently deals with their burden in the round, which is to explain why a theory is immoral. First, let's just go into to clarify some things. Why is it true that we think fairness is the most important moral principle, especially with regards to material goods, not as regards to who you are as a person, which is always just a version of diversity, not equality. We think all of most morality is premised on equality. Why? I think there is the idea that nothing makes me inherently better than other people. This means that these ideas force inequality and unfairness is bad, which is to say most theories of morality don't say that you can treat certain people way worse because they don't deserve these things. In general, we think the idea of trying to punish people is bad. OG tries to bring up the idea of sending people to jail. I don't think this is particularly moral. I think the reason we ought to send people to jail is to help them get better and become a better person. I don't think we should be vindictive with our punishment and hope that other people should suffer. This is not a justification for morality. It is a justification for changing our criminal system, even in a communist world. I think this is good. I think we also, secondly, need equality of opportunity. To get equality of opportunity, we need material goods. So I think for any idea of self-actualization or the ability to access these types of things, this is really important. This means material inequality is much worse than other forms of inequality because we can do something to prevent it. Sure, some people are taller and some people are shorter, and maybe we should redistribute height if we could, but we can't do that. We can make it so that people have equal opportunities, and we can make it so the shelves are lower so short people can reach them too. I think this is more important because it allows them to access the things that they would have the ability to do if not for the actions of other people, which I think is necessary for moral good. Second, why do we actually get better agency? OG claims that we don't respond to this. The reason we think agency is important, we think we just access it much better. First, I think it is we do to a degree think it is acceptable to take away some amount of agency, i.e. we prevent people from murdering others or yelling fire in a theater in order to maximize the good of people and allow them to access their agency. We think this standard is what makes everyone able to access their ability, and so they aren't unfairly oppressed by others. We think in systems of capitalism or in systems that are not communism, even if you are making people work, then you are allowing them to access the basic goods they need to provide their life. We think this is necessary. It is not, oftentimes we think that basic security ought to be protected. E.g., I have a right not to be harmed by others. But I think equal to that right is the idea that I shouldn't be harmed by others by the fact that they control all the food, and therefore their refusal to give me any is directly harming me as well. This is a moral principle that I think most people agree with overall. So I think this is quite important that we do these things. But second, I think also the theory of communism is just perhaps premised on a view about people that we don't agree with, but is not more immoral. E.g., the people think that people will naturally work and naturally do these things. So the theory of communism says that even if there is some transitional state, that is more an objective view of what will happen, not what is necessary to happen. They believe it will be voluntarily done, that people will do these things. And I think maybe you disagree with that being true, but I don't think it makes the theory immoral. Moreover, I think there are cases where, at least on a small scale, this type of behavior does work. For example, if you look to kibbutzes in Israel, where they voluntarily work together and they're able to do it if it is a small community, even if you can't do it on a large scale. So I think it's just the premise that this is forced is also just simply untrue. Then I think it's just the agency is the OG argument is that central planning is bad. I think the alternative is that one person controls the means of production and your death and completely your destiny and controls all part of your day. This is much, much worse because they don't have benevolent, they only care about themselves. At least with some form of government, they care about you to some extent. They want you to do better. I also just think in general, work should not define people, and it shouldn't be the thing that controls your life. I think without communism, the poor simply become workhorses and spend 12 hours of their day on work that they're not able to better themselves. The idea that just creating more material goods is the ultimate goal, I think, is generally bad. I don't know if so much research and development to create the newest iPhone actually makes people morally any better off or happier in any type of way. I think it is much better that everyone be able to have leisure, to be able to do these things that I think communism provides to a much greater extent. Finally, on this point of agency, I think you are only able to self-actualize when you have choices. And I think choices, furthermore, are simply the basis of humanity. They make us different from animals who run on instinct. It means you respect the human mind of all people. I think it's the idea that you are not able to do these things and you are only forced to just work these long hours. Moreover, I think part of the problem is that oftentimes in these capitalist societies, we don't ever give people choices because we punish them for being poor and make them worse off. E.g., it's very expensive to be poor because it's very expensive. You pay more in rent if you get evicted, these types of things, which means you're never able to access any of these self choices that they get. I will take a point from closing if they have one.
Yeah, so Marx himself observed the tendency of capitalism to moderate and pass things that cater towards workers. Surely that means you don't get the absolutely horrific exploitative capitalism that you say will happen on our side.
I'm fairly confident that we do, just given that this is the status quo. I don't think it moderates all that well. Maybe Marx said it, but I don't think that is realistic. I don't think it changes the theory of communism. I think we have very exploitative tendencies because the idea of capitalism is based on inherent self-interest, whereas the theory of communism is based on the idea that we ought to care about others and the well-being of others. So I don't think that's true. I think it does tend towards these very abusive thoughts. A couple of things in this round. First, I don't think OG gives many arguments to whether or not something is moral or immoral. I think their arguments are mostly outcome-based, but I don't think that actually sufficiently fulfills their burden in the round. like, e.g., like, I don't know why R&D matters, but I also think communism theory suggests that people have a natural desire to work and discover and become better people. They basically say agency is important, but we think we access this much better if the ultimate goal is the ability to make choices that you desire and the ability to do things that you care about. This is only met if you have your needs met and the fact that you are voluntarily working. This means it's like good. I think there are a few things. What does it take for a theory to be moral? First, I think it supports a system that is more moral than the alternatives. Basically, I think OG kind of tries to say that there's just simply no morality because everything is immoral. I think if that's the case, we ought to default to the idea that some things are more moral than others, and that theory is going to be more moral than overall. Second, I think it's something that respects the inherent dignity of people. I think people have an inherent dignity that makes them different from humans, and anything that violates that dignity is immoral. Their ability to control their own lives, their ability to control the means of production, their ability to have basic necessities met are premised on that. I think we, as opening opposition team, tell you why you are why the three tenets of communism are inherently moral and why this is better than any alternatives. We think under multiple theories of morality, both utilitarianism and deontology, and a principle of fairness, we explain to you why this is most important. For all those reasons, so proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker. Now to start off closing half, I invite member of government. Here.
Am I audible? Awesome. My speech, I prefer POIs in chat, please. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. What is communism? The theory of communism says that basically capitalism is inherently exploitative. You then have a vanguard party and a dictatorship of the proletariat. But ultimately, this leads to the abolition of the state. We think the reason we are able to take this debate is because opening governments never deal with the end state. Instead, they only talk about the process of transformation, and we think this is not what this debate is about. This debate is about the end state, when we are able to achieve this communist utopia without any of the practical concerns, and we think we should be debating whether this end state is preferable and whether this theory is justified or whether it's immoral. With that said, we're going to bring you 3 things from CG. First, why you get other critiques and the amelioration of the worst excesses of capitalism on our side. Second, how communism makes us deny fundamental parts of our human nature and why this is immoral. And third, why property is inherently a good thing, even in the best case of communism, where the state is abolished. Rebuttals are going to be integrated. First argument, why do we get critiques and the amelioration of the worst excesses of capitalism on our side? Several reasons. First, we think people were critiquing capitalism even before communism happened. So for example, even Adam Smith had lots of critiques of capitalism within his writing. This is likely to continue even without communism. Second, we're moving away from the Chicago School of Economics and the unbridled capitalism that opposition wants to push onto us, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. We realize that just capitalism without any checks and balances is incredibly harmful. Thirdly, there are lots of empirical examples of how we have been shifting away and how we have been dealing with the worst excesses of capitalism. For example, the existence of the welfare state, how most countries currently provide things like universal healthcare to its citizens, how there's increased safety nets for everyone, especially in countries like Scandinavian countries. In this system, the vast majority of basic needs are provided for even under the current system of capitalism. Why are these 3 reasons important? We think this is really important because we have to prove the comparative as OO and CO have demanded. The comparative is not this unchecked capitalism, which means that communism is a much more palatable option. If the society is all right under capitalism, we think that the opportunity cost of communism and transition, the risk of failure, etc., means the trade-off is much higher and it's immoral to propagate the theory of communism. That's why we think this argument fills the gap that's missing in OG. Second argument, how does communism make us deny fundamental parts of our human nature and why is this immoral? First, who are actually humans? We think humans are really aspirational. They want things and they aspire to greater value. So we think communism denies this because it suggests that people should be equal and you should be unable to rise through society. Opening ops analysis on the inherent harms of inequality proves exactly this argument. So we think that also humans are relational, right? We measure ourselves relative to each other and our current base point. That's why people are often unhappy, even though living standards have risen across like centuries, because we are comparing ourselves to other people people, and we think that we would have been happy to make the final, for example, in our case, but now we really want to win. However, this ability to measure ourselves and gain this happiness to each other no longer exists in the final version of communism, because it aims to deny people of exactly this inequality and the ability to compare yourselves to other people, because it's seen as something that's really bad. Thirdly, we think that humans are believers in free will. They have a sense of agency, regardless of whether the world is deterministic or not, which was the opening clash. We think that people feel like protagonists in their life story who want to do things. However, the communist system forces people to deny things and even reject their own experiences. What happens under communism is that access to people's preferences are diminished. So the thing that's the end goal of communism and liberalism, as Mill describes, is basically the same. Namely, that there's a society of experimental individuals who basically find their own method of flourishing. The difference, however, is the method. Communism says that people don't understand their preferences, i.e. things like false consciousness, and they need to be coerced into revolution by the vanguard of the proletariat. We think this is terrible. Why is this point important? The OO case is that basic needs being met is enough for happiness and satisfaction in your life. However, we think this is a necessary but not sufficient condition, especially as we've proven to you how under the current system, most people's basic needs are basically already met already. So the op benefits are not exclusive to their side. We think in order to get happiness, you need a sense of agency and freedom, which underlies this. What this means is, if something means that people are forced to act against their own will, we think that is bad. So comparing this to opening government, they say that agency is important, but we don't think they actually are able to prove why it is. We think the reason is that people are willing to trade off utility in order to get to other higher goals. So for example, protesters in Hong Kong, my home city, people are willing to trade off material benefits to themselves to achieve something higher than themselves. This matters because morality is basically just a series of intuition pumps to determine what people really think and to build claims from them. But most people don't intuition pump communism. So therefore, we think that this proves how we are able to provide agency and how it's a good thing. Before moving on to my last argument, opening up.
The problem with capitalist states making concessions and giving some degree of welfare is that it only temporarily calms the masses and allows the rich to consolidate their power more and thus continue to do worse things in the long term. The only way to stop perpetual suffering for the worse off is through communism as a result.
Okay, we don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the rich being like getting richer or becoming happier, as long as the basic needs of certain people are fulfilled. We think if we're able to prove that everyone's basic needs are going to be fulfilled, there's no reason to drag everyone down to this level and prevent other people from gaining more happiness. Third argument, why is private property an inherently good thing, even in the best case of communism when the state is abolished? First, we think private property is a principled right, and all rights are spatial rights. So what this means is your right to shelter or your right to use anything is contingent on the fact that you own that thing and you have the space to do that. Private property means you have something to the exclusion of everything else. And we think that communism opposing this denies you all other rights which are spatial in nature. You need exclusive access to things in order to do these basic functions, and therefore we think we need private property. But secondly, some private property is acquired justly. And we think even if we only prove some is acquired justly, if opposition wants to deny everyone the right to own private property, this is immoral. So we think that in an abstract exchange between you and me, if we both have the things that the other person wants, we're allowed to sell to each other. So this is an instance where private property is acquired justly. We think even though some private property is unjustly acquired, this is not important. Because of all these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome the member of opposition. Here. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah. Am I audible now? Okay, perfect. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a few things in this speech, but first I'm going to talk a bit about what the theory of communism is and what probably the burden on opposition side is likely to be, because I don't think anyone's really addressed this to any reasonable degree. Communism proposes that capitalist structures harm the proletariat, but it also proposes that capitalism is inevitably unsustainable and will eventually devolve into communism unavoidably over time, through some sort of revolution. I think what this means is that the theory primarily acts to critique capitalist structures and is not always prescriptive. This means that like it's not exactly saying that we should revolt violently. See the history of like the union movement in the UK, which simply seeks to use communist theory to mitigate the harms of capitalism. I think then any material harms of a system following communist theoretical frameworks has to be weighed against regimes established by most likely competing political extremists in a comparative way, because the theory itself is the debate. So while its contribution to a given regime is probably fair game for government side, the full extent of harms must be weighed against the reasonable alternative. I think this means that like the harms under like the USSR have to be weighed against harms of likely other states emerging if communism was not the theoretical framework. I think we take OG at their best then, and we account for the worst case scenarios. Okay, which societies actually adopt authoritarian communism? Overall, likely societies in which the material needs of citizens are threatened and citizens feel alienated and exploited to a degree in which they make the personal calculus, the violent revolution and its associated threats is worth the comparative benefit of a regime change to a communist system, noting that this often looks like societies that already remove freedom and are authoritarian in some way already. This could look like Tsarist Russia, which is or other like monarchies, see like the Paris Commune. This could look like right-wing dictatorships, also often a result of imperialism in the first place. For example, like South America in the 50s was largely run by corrupt authoritarian right-wing governments, and all of their policies were essentially dictated by 3 American banana companies. And this is like largely the reason why they decided to have socialist revolutions in the first place. What is the comparative then? Largely societies in which citizens are generally happy, like liberal democracies, are incredibly unlikely to pursue violent revolution and establishment of authoritarian communist states, because firstly, citizens are more risk averse when they have more to lose. Secondarily, alienation only occurs when agency is removed to a huge degree, which is a necessary precursor to this kind of revolution. And lastly, most residents of liberal democracies highly value concepts of opposition to political violence and maintaining civility and individual choice largely through voting. I think this means that only already awful societies will enact authoritarian communism. Why is this better than the alternative? Well, firstly, societies likely to actually enact full-state communism have an alternative that is, from the perspective of the citizens, worse for their material conditions, i.e. why they revolted in the first place. This looks like historical alternatives to the USSR not being a liberal democracy, but some other authoritarian group that fills the power vacuum after overthrowing the Tsar, something like this, and probably has terrible outcomes for things like the life standard of citizens or something like object monarchy, which removes all of the agency that we're told is so good from opening government, because the necessarily alternative to communism isn't capitalism, it could be something else. I think also noting that you don't access any benefits that were talked about in opening government, a worker agency or innovation, because these aren't accessed in any authoritarian regime. Like you don't have much agency if you live in Nazi Germany. I think we have a relative conservation of preferences on our side. Then secondarily, I think this acts as a proportional mitigation of prior injustices, insofar as individuals feel that material violence enacted by capital, whether by imperialist corporations or dictatorships, is an intrinsic attack upon their ability to exist in security and safety. I think this is morally analogous to self-defense, i.e. they are legitimate in enacting harm to reduce their own suffering. We allow them to access a means to fight back. I think we access reduction of harm. We better fulfill the state duty to protect the material interests of citizens, and I think we better access preferences. Okay, then why is this theory good in other contexts, i.e. not in revolutionary conditions? Communism is a highly persuasive critical framework that appeals to people's want to simplify a chaotic world to an explainable series of class conflicts. Secondarily, appeals to the feeling of alienation felt by those who feel exploited and misunderstood. And lastly, providing catharsis to those harmed by those systems, especially noting the appeal of this analysis often appeals to people's historical unequal capital distribution, things like this. This is why the Black Panthers often use communist frameworks in activist material critiquing racism. I think this persuasiveness means that we access important benefits. Largely this will like circulate through things like pamphlets, but also through places like universities, which are often hubs of activism and hubs of political advocacy. I think we get a few benefits from this. The first is the one to mitigate the harms of capitalism that already exist, pointed out convincingly by communism. The first is through like things like labor organization. We're able to appeal to the problems of workers, redirect any anger away that was like directed towards things like false consciousness and towards youthful outlets like legislation and union movements. I think this is why the union movement started in like the UK in the first place, which is where Marx primarily rose to prominence. We get better material conditions for workers. We get this is how we got things like the 5-day work week. This is how we eliminated things like child labor. This is the reason why we aren't all working 12-hour days in the status quo. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
So this is an argument to explain why the theoretical framework might be potentially used, not why the theory of communism, which is different from the theoretical framework of Marxism, is applied and how it's applied in its use in theory.
The theory of communism and the theoretical framework of communism are one and the same. They are inextricably linked. You have to use the theoretical framework of communism to advocate for communism. I'm explaining to you why in societies that will literally never have a communist revolution, it is useful for this theoretical framework to be circulated because it helps get other benefits, even because these societies are never going to turn into the USSR. I think then also in other activism, you're able to view inequalities in a more tangible way, i.e. through unequal distribution of capital. This provides a valuable framework to pursue things like decolonization, things like anti-racism, because you can point to the tangible harms and historical harms that have been perpetrated against these groups. I think we also provide just general levels of catharsis and a sense of meaning to those who suffer under systems of capitalism. But lastly and importantly, we provide a justification that can be co-opted by less radical left-leaning ideologies. We wouldn't have the welfare state or social safety nets or levels of socialization to the same degree without Marxist thinkers. There's a clear path of like mutation into other ideologies that lends greatly to the palatability of the fundamental ideas of economic equality and reparative material justice. Even if we never get Marxist politicians, we might get social democratic politicians. And I think that this is a comparative benefit on our side. I think for all of these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome the government whip. Here.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Cool. Let me get my timer up. Oh. Okay. Cool. I need to organize my notes. Hang on. Okay. There we go. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I have 3 observations to make about this debate before I go into it team by team. Observation 1 is just a clarification of what morality is. We say you probably don't have access to some objective morality. You don't know what God wants to do, or it's really hard to find that out. So the way that we build morality is based on what people think by asking them a series of intuition pumps and using that to lead to outcomes. If lots of people share those things, then those are things that we probably consider to be moral. Sharon explains to you why, given the nature of communism and what it outlines, probably people are likely to think that it's immoral, and so it probably is on those grounds. Second observation is on the nature of what communism is and what we're discussing, which is to say, it's the specific thing about capitalism inevitably leads towards crisis. Then that's why you need some degree of revolution, either led by a vanguard, although Marx initially said it would just happen naturally. And so that leads to an outcome, namely the state gets control of things, eventually for it to be democratized. It's not the tangential things about the theory of, about potential theoretical frameworks that result from communism, etc. We're not necessarily talking about the Hamburg's or the Frankfurt School here. We're just talking about the specific things that are key towards communism itself. Third observation, I don't think this debate is about the other things that communism has led to, which is what closing opposition hinged their extension on. This is a value judgment debate specifically about the theory of communism itself and whether or not that's something that's moral or immoral. I think that we prove that it's immoral. Okay, on to the team by team stuff. Firstly, weighing against opening government. I think the problem with OG is that their characterization in the vast majority of their case is contingent upon a very specific reading of communism, namely the sort of Leninist communism that opening opposition, I think even Jason identifies in the POI, about the vanguard of the proletariat and so on. I think that Sharon's harms, particularly in her second argument about why private property is inherently immoral, are a lot more important here because they exist even in the ideal state of communism. Because the end state of communism is one where there's no state, there's no private property, everyone's just kind of living kind of in existence. I think that Sharon explains why that end state is actually necessarily really harmful because of the fact that private property itself is something that's quite good. The spatial analysis that Sharon gives you is really important. And I just want to briefly cover it because I didn't really get a response from CO, which is that in order to actually do particular actions, like in order to sleep somewhere or do anything like that, you need to own the ground under which it occurs. You need to own like the bed to do it, or own the shelter that goes on and so on. That can only happen with private property when you have exclusive access to these things. That can't happen under the communist model. And that's something that's inherently wrong. The second thing is that we actually demonstrate why communism is likely to infringe upon people's agency and why agency specifically matters in the round. Because if the framing I said at the top of my speech is true, which is that morality is basically what people think it is, then, and if, as Sharon explains to you, because communism infringes upon key aspects of human nature, like aspirationalism or the fact that we relate ourselves to other people, that probably means that communism itself is immoral because lots of people think that it is. I think that this proves opening government's key benefit, which is that communism infringes upon agency without actually explaining why it does that inherently or why agency is actually good. I think Sharon is able to fill in those links, and so we probably take it over them. Secondly, in terms of closing opposition, the first thing I want to note is that it's incredibly hard to just do things like counterfactual history and make bold claims about, there was a banana republic or whatever, so this is the likely alternative. I would point out, for instance, like the US only did that out of fear of communism, which presumably might not happen outside the House. But secondly, this debate is not saying communism, like this House would prefer communism not to exist. That's not the government case. The government case is saying communism has existed. Is this a moral thing or is this not? We tell you that it isn't. I think a lot of closing opposition's harms are basically based on a reality where communism wouldn't exist, rather than actual moral judgments on the nature of communism itself. And that's the specific material that Sharon provides to you. So yeah, on the other stuff they say about communism enabled these critiques of capitalism, which is really important, and opening opposition kind of say this too. I think there are other potential frameworks that already critique capitalism. Even Charles Dickens was doing it in his like literature, right? And he's not really much of a communist. Things like humanism, like Sartre, etc. All these people tend to exist, and indeed humanism kind of caused the first like French Revolution, for instance. I think people just generally like feel that massive degrees of inequality is quite bad, especially if people are working quite hard. And I don't think that's something that's necessarily unique towards like communism. I think it can exist in other instances, and indeed that's what Sharon's first extension actually proves. But thirdly, on the stuff they say about this being an important theoretical framework, I think that, like, again, these theoretical frameworks can exist on our side of the house, and the debate isn't specifically about this. I would also suggest that communism actually detracts from improving life because it creates this moral, like, idealist scenario of what people should settle for, rather than actually making them happy with what they have at the moment. It's just you should try and seize control of power in a revolution that's probably likely to fail. I think that's actually might be quite bad in these instances. Secondly, finally on opening opposition, before I go on actually to I'll take a POI from them, yeah.
Gov Bench does not address our claims that capitalist societies, no matter how much they lean to a welfare state in the short term, always allow the rich to control the means of production, despite their selfish motivations, and thus immorally control the destinies of the masses, denying their ability to have agency or even control property, which you want to talk about, like people are able to do in small communist communities like kibbutzes.
But like, why is like, firstly, a kibbutz is like a small scale thing, whatever. But secondly, why is rich people owning the means of production if they compensate their workers fairly and those workers are able to buy things? Why is that an inherent wrong or inherent exploitation? This is precisely the problem with communism, right? Is that it tells people to deny the existence of their own preferences and instead advocate for some Marxist utopia whereby workers don't know what they want, and so we need to force them into doing what they want. And that's precisely the harm that Sharon expresses. Okay, on the stuff they say about capitalism being inherently horrific for opening opposition, I think Sharon already proves why capitalism is able to moderate, and also other moral critiques of capitalism exist. So for instance, Rawls criticizes these things along the same lines. Their main claim though is that like things are morally arbitrary, so you shouldn't have equality. I don't think this justifies absolute equality. It probably just justifies like equality of starting point or equality of opportunity, as Rawls would suggest. But also crucially, it's really unclear why their arbitrary state is better than the initial state that exists under capitalism, because their state is arbitrary too, right? You're arbitrarily taking everything and just giving it to every single person in equal proportions, and it's unclear why that arbitrary thing is better than the initially arbitrary thing, which is capitalism, that exists. I also think, finally, that OO's conception of happiness is quite poor. It just says that you need material needs, but Sharon explains why it's not that. It's all about agency and your ability to aspire to do things. That's what communism prevents. That's why it's immoral. Proud to propose.
I thank the speaker, and now for the final speaker, opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Cool, could I check if I'm audible? Cool, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Oh, sorry, I missed the button on my timer. Let me retry. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. There are two tiers of impact in which Keris's extension wins this debate. The first is the three principal moral frameworks in which Keris applies as to why communism is moral. 1. Unlike any other critiques of communism, communism is a uniquely proportional means of mitigating prior injustice that grants people who have been exploited an act of self-defense and basic necessities. Note that things like the state of nature or Adam Smith's critique of communism necessarily are insufficient to mitigate the injustices that have occurred against people who have had their labor and property stripped from them by the bourgeois and subsequently withheld. Subsequently, the only way in which we are able to proportionally mitigate this injustice is by granting these people the property and the labor that has been stripped from them again, and ensuring that there is a base level ceiling by which nobody is ever able to inflict this injustice again. Second moral framework, the ability for individuals to access catharsis. What does this look like? I think what this looks like is the specific language surrounding communist theory being unique language that enables individuals to articulate their experience, enables them to relate themselves to the society that oppresses them, and grants them the catharsis of knowing just what injustice is happening to them, noting that any action which they take to mitigate that injustice is contingent on the information that they possess of knowing that that injustice is occurring in the first place. And so far as communism grants that, it illuminates the struggles that these people are occurring and subsequently has to be considered moral. Thirdly, I think communism is the only means of guaranteeing the state duty of ensuring that everybody has basic necessities. Note that the point that the state deprives us of autonomy and makes us cede certain rights to it, we necessarily take a contract with the state whereby they must provide a degree of necessities for us in order to benefit from the state. Insofar as the state is unable to provide us necessities like housing to actually participate in it to any meaningful extent, it necessarily fails in that duty under the moral frameworks of mitigating injustice, of the state being legitimate, and ensuring that individuals have the access to the information of knowing that they are harmed. We win. I think it's a lazy response from closing government to say that there is no such thing as objective morality, insofar as I have done the analysis as to why these are specifically moral frameworks we should care about. 2. Keris has a specific other strata of information as to why we win this debate, which is on the fact that the theory of communism has also done things. Therefore, if we are trying to adjudicate the morality and the theoretical effects of it, we have to consider what the world would not look like had it not existed in order to evaluate this. Subsequently, Keris wins this in two key respects. First of all, the tangential effects of communist theory, insofar as it grants the language to workers, insofar as it illuminates some of the struggles that they have and tells them that they are able to construct things like unions in order to try and mitigate against the struggles that they are encountering in society. The reason why this is specifically important is because opening government try and stand over a counterfactual as to where they are going to access democratic socialism. Note that the specific, persuasive, unique nature of communist theory that closing government ignored, and the manner in which it took place in universities where it was able to distribute academic material to workers and was able to specifically weaponize the radical young left, means that it is able to uniquely spread all of this information and engage in all of the practical changes that are a precursor to the democratic socialist theories and regulations that opening government talk about. Given this, the question that you have to ask is, has this theory not existed? What occurs on the comparative? On the comparative, the thing that opening government do have to contend with is the point that all of their material as to why this is immoral is specifically rooted in the practical. It's necessarily contingent on them having to stand over some sort of counterfactual. The problem with the counterfactual and why it is necessarily going to be worse is that ultimately individuals are always going to engage in some degree of revolution in these states because they want to do something to redress their material conditions. The question is what? Note that at the point that societies necessarily have to have a binding narrative at the point that they are trying to forge themselves in a post-revolution state, I will posit to you that they would default to a worse narrative than the narrative of being equal to all men under a communist framework, and they probably engage in shit like chauvinistic nationalism, meaning that on both a moral framework in terms terms of all of the injustices that we are able to mitigate against, and a consequentialist framework in terms of all the tangentially related injustices, in terms of our actual ability to improve people's material condition, and in terms of stemming the awful counterfactuals that would occur as a result of this, we are going to win this debate. Subsequently, the reason why we are able to take this above opening opposition is, first of all, providing you a comparative, practical, moralistic framework and proving that there are worse harms that would be committed had this theory not existed. And secondarily, weighing our moral framework beyond opening opposition, simply saying that this is what people often define as being moral, proving that there are cosmic injustices that are being committed that we are able to mitigate against. I'm going to do two additional things in this speech. One, I'm going to briefly put closing government out of this debate. Two, I'm going to throw up onto opening government and solve this long diagonal. Before that, I want to make one note about preferences in this debate. The problem is any material regarding agency is contingent on people being able to access for preferences. Two reasons why this can't happen under capitalism. One, people are deprived of the capital and the skills which they need in order to be able to access for preferences. And so far as if you do not have your basic livelihood, you are unable to ever access all of these things. But secondly, and even more importantly, your conception of preferences is contingent on the access that you have to information. And so far as capitalist structures will necessarily always have things like advertising slogans and shit, which enable you to have your brain washed by this, you're never going to be able to access preferences, probably on either side of a house in government's best case. The question then becomes how you best access them on our side, and we feel like you do that because one, preferences in your conception of a good life necessarily changes at the point that your relative conception of what is good is now brought down by communism. We feel like you have accessed your preferences, unclear why that's different than accessing them. And secondarily, even if preferences are not accessed on either side, we guarantee people's material condition. Cool. I've taken out closing government's counterfactuals regarding critiques. Briefly, why property is always going to be immoral. At the point that I am able to exist under capitalism and acquire a multitude of property and be a lazy landlord and specifically deprive other people of property, I think this is specifically when I'm committing an act of harm. And even if some property is legitimately occurred, I think at the point that there is the capacity for property to be illegitimately occurred, it is a structure that should not exist. Cool. The reason then why we are able to take it over opening government is twofold. One, I think we are able to specifically prove that we are right, I think we are able to specifically prove that insofar as they rely on instrumental benefits regarding innovation and access to the value of labor, they have to contend that the material condition and prosperity should be valued. Given that our comparative takes them at their best and explains why things are going to be worse in their world, meaning that we are comparatively able to not only access the practical benefits of agency and improvement to societal structures, but also all of the principal benefits that they necessarily have to concede they lose regarding the ability for people to know what's happened to them, regarding the ability for people to mitigate against all of these systemic injustices of colonialism and exploitation, we necessarily win in all the frameworks provided in this debate. Mic drop, seal.
All right, I thank all speakers, I thank all teams, thank you very much. Again, I believe that all debaters may exit the room while the judges stay here for deliberation after the live has gone off.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Guys.